The following is a presentation of Apologetics Press.
The law of rationality in philosophy says that a person should only draw conclusions that can be drawn from the evidence. For a belief to be rational, it has to have evidence that warrants that belief. For a theory to be able to even claim to be scientific, it has to have scientific evidence in support of it. Evolutionists believe that they have found scientific evidence to support their theory. If it can be shown to be illegitimate, then evolution proves to be an irrational belief. If you were to ask an evolutionist, where's the proof for evolution? You're probably going to hear a discussion of some or all of these alleged proofs of evolution that are on the screen. Biology textbooks typically have several pages devoted to discussing the evidences for evolutionary theories. In the next 3 sessions, we'll wade through this alleged proof of evolution and see if it passes the science test. Ernst Haeckel, German biologist and avid supporter of Charles Darwin, popularized the theory now known as embryonic recapitulation. He drew charts like the one shown. Embryonic recapitulation, called the biogenetic law by Haeckel, not to be confused with the law of biogenesis, but the biogenetic law. This is the idea that embryos, as they develop in the womb, repeat the evolutionary development of their species. So, for instance, according to this theory, as human embryos are developing, they go through stages where they look like various animals that were supposedly in our evolutionary timeline, fish and so forth. Supposedly, there's a period of time when human embryos have gills and tails, like our supposed evolutionary ancestors. Haeckel drew pictures of various species and different phases of their embryological development and put them side by side to try to bolster the case for evolution. Embryonic recapitulation is still taught in many biology classes today, using the catchphrase, ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. The problem is that it was shown by scientists to be false decades ago. For instance, the alleged gill slits that Haeckel claimed proved humans evolved from fish were found to actually be just folds of flesh that later develop into different structures in the neck region. They never serve as breathing apparatus as gills do in fish. Aaron Wasserman, biologist of City University of New York, said the mammalian embryo can in no sense be called a fish. It never actually develops functional gills and is at all times a mammal. Bottom line, as the famous George Gaylord Simpson and William Beck said in their textbook, Life, An Introduction to Biology, it is now firmly established that ontogeny does not recapitulate phylogeny. So according to prominent evolutionists in the more recent past, Haeckel was wrong. Embryos don't mimic Darwinian evolution as they grow in the womb. Erich Blechschmidt was a prominent German embryologist and anatomist, the namesake of the Blechschmidt Collection and Museum at the University of Göttingen. He didn't pull any punches in his criticism of Haeckel's theory. He said, the so-called basic law of biogenetics is wrong. No buts or ifs can mitigate this fact. It's not even a tiny bit correct or correct in a different form. It is totally wrong. Well, if that's true, what of Haeckel's diagram? Bottom line, the material it displays is fake, a hoax, misrepresentations, even lies. He not only altered his illustrations of embryos, he even printed the same plate of an embryo 3 times and labeled one human, one a dog, and the third a rabbit in order to show their similarities. The late W.R. Thompson, renowned entomologist and one-time director of the Commonwealth Institute of Biological Control, who wrote the introduction to a 1967 edition of Darwin's Origin of Species, he said regarding Haeckel's chart, when the convergence of embryos was not entirely satisfactory, Haeckel altered the illustrations of them to fit his theory. The alterations were slight but significant. The biogenetic law as a proof of evolution is valueless. Haeckel misrepresented the evidence, and according to Professor Arnold Bass, even stole his drawings and adjusted them slightly before adding them to his chart. Ultimately, Haeckel was exposed for his fraudulent behavior by Professor L. Rudemeyer of Basel University. History records that he was then charged with fraud by 5 professors and was ultimately convicted in an academic court at the University of Jena. Haeckel admitted that he altered his drawings, but defended himself by saying, "I should feel utterly condemned and annihilated by the admission were it not that hundreds of the best observers and biologists lie under the same charge. The great majority of all morphological, anatomical, histological, and embryological diagrams are not true to nature, but are more or less doctored, schematized, and reconstructed." According to Haeckel, hundreds of the best observers and biologists lie in the same way he did, at least the ones he seems to be aware of and probably rubbed elbows with, which are likely evolutionists along with himself. That certainly gives us a lot of confidence in the evolutionary scientific community. Haeckel perpetuated a hoax. Even many evolution-friendly biology textbooks admit as much today. Miller and Levine's textbook Biology, used widely in the U.S. and published by Prentice Hall, says, Ernst Haeckel fudged some of his drawings to make the earliest stages of some embryos seem more similar than they actually are. Sadly, in spite of such admissions, biology textbooks still use embryonic recapitulation as proof of evolution. In fact, this statement on the screen is in the section of the book titled Evidence of Evolution. What about homologous structures? What's that argument all about? Evolutionists argue that many vertebrate species have structures that are constructed from the same basic bones and therefore are similar. Because of this similarity, they argue, as does this biology textbook, that homologous structures provide strong evidence that all four-limbed vertebrates have descended with modifications from common ancestors. So, similar-looking anatomical structures, according to evolutionists, are strong evidence that we share a common ancestry with whales and frogs. Darwin himself saw homology as a strong point in support of evolution. He said, "We have seen that the members of the same class, independently of their habits of life, resemble each other in the general plan of their organization. Is it not powerfully suggestive of true relationship, of inheritance from a common ancestor?" Well, is that true? After all, aren't our similarities to our siblings and parents proof of our relation to them? First of all, it's important to realize that creationists don't deny that similarities exist between different creatures. Creationists don't deny the evidence. There's no need to. It always harmonizes with the true creation model. The problem isn't the evidence, it's the interpretation by evolutionists of that evidence. While the evolutionist says that similarities prove a common ancestor, the creationist says that commonalities prove a common designer. Consider the automobile industry. Many GMC models, for example, use the same wheels, the same brake systems, windshield wipers, light bulbs, and even have very similar body shapes with one another. But why? Not because they came to life and mutated from one model into another. Their homologous structures, their similarities exist because they were designed by the same company. They share a common designer. And those vehicles were all designed to drive on similar roads and freeways and to use the same gas and the same sorts of mechanics. In the same way, when God designed the lung to be suitable for life on earth, one would expect a very similar design to be used in other beings that would be living contemporaneously on the same planet and in the same relative environment. In truth, when examined closely, the evolutionist homology argument quickly starts to break down and inconsistencies arise. For instance, humans share very similar analogous structures with several creatures. Human structures share similarities with the octopus eye, the pig heart, the Pekingese dog's face, the milk of a donkey, and the pronator quadratus muscle of the Japanese salamander. But evolutionists would hardly deem these creatures relatives of man. Even certain plants and the crustacean Daphnia have hemoglobin, as do humans. Are these close relations of man? And another inconsistency, if similarity proves common ancestry, then shouldn't dissimilarity prove no common ancestry? There's more dissimilarities between humans and other animals than there are similarities. So the homology argument only works when you pick and choose. In truth, it makes more sense that there was a common designer of these creatures who used certain structural features several times in many different creatures due to the fact that these anatomical structures are ideal for life in similar environments on this same planet. The homology argument can hardly be used as solid evidence for evolution when structural similarities can easily be interpreted in another way, a way that doesn't contain inconsistencies and therefore is more in line with the evidence. What about genetic similarities? Haven't scientists discovered that human DNA is like 98 to 99% identical to chimpanzee DNA? On the surface, that seems like a pretty strong argument for the evolution of man from an ape-like common ancestor and for our close relation, and it's been touted as such for years. Again, when you look deeper and think about this alleged proof, you find that these claims are extremely misleading. Jonathan Marks, evolutionary anthropologist and geneticist, who was a professor at Yale for several years as well as at UC Berkeley, and who is now a professor at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, he talks extensively about the dangers of misinterpreting the genetic evidence and reading too much into the DNA similarities between chimps and humans. In his book, What It Means to Be 98% Chimpanzee, he discusses the misleading tendency to compare long chains of genetic subunits in DNA. He says, but the comparison can also be misleading in two important ways. First, such comparisons of DNA sequence ignore qualitative differences, those of kind rather than amount. The second misleading area of DNA sequence comparisons entails a consideration of the other end of the scale. He explains that because DNA is a linear array of those four bases, A, G, C, and T, only four possibilities exist at any specific point in a DNA sequence. The laws of chance tell us that two random sequences from species that have no ancestry in common will match at about 1 in every 4 sites. Thus, even two unrelated DNA sequences will be 25% identical, not 0% identical. In other words, the DNA of a human and any other creature that has DNA will be at least 25% identical. So using the same DNA comparisons that are used to compare chimps and humans, a daffodil is 25% human genetically, since it has DNA. And according to Marx, its sequence will match with humans at least 25% of the time. Does that sound like an accurate comparison to you? Is a daffodil 1/4 human, really? Of course not. Now, seemingly as this kind of realization about the genetic code is becoming more and more widespread, and as more research is conducted, some geneticists have begun to slowly move away from the argument that chimps are 98 to 99% human and therefore share a common ancestor. Not only are geneticists recognizing that such comparisons are misleading, but they're starting to realize that they're just flat out wrong in the first place. In 2002, for example, a new research study by Caltech presented at the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences proved that human and chimp DNA is actually at least 5% different, and this will likely continue to grow as DNA is studied more. But still, ultimately, isn't 4 to 5% a pretty small difference? No, not when we're talking about genetics and DNA. It could be a huge difference. Consider, if we took all of the DNA from every cell and compared the DNA in monkeys and humans, that 4 to 5% difference would represent about 200 million differences between the body of a human and an ape. So 4 to 5% is no small issue. Looked at in that light, humans and chimps are not so similar after all. When evolutionists pick such comparisons as support for their theory, they're really not telling the whole story. They do what comes natural to all of us. They seem to pick and choose what results they'll highlight based on what appears to support their theory. Consider another factor which doesn't support their theory. DNA, the fundamental blueprint of life, is squeezed closely into chromosomes, and all cells with a nucleus have a specific number of chromosomes. If humans and chimpanzees were so close genetically and share a common ancestor, then wouldn't common sense tell us that we should, at the very least, expect them to have the same number of chromosomes in their cells? Well, it seems like it, but that's not the case. While humans have 46 chromosomes, chimps have 48. Well, that's pretty close, isn't it? Well, again, no. Such differences could actually represent significant dissimilarities. A 2-chromosome difference in every nucleus of every cell in the body, billions? That's no small difference. Again, such quantitative comparisons don't actually tell us much at all about similarities, and they definitely don't prove a common ancestry. Consider, for instance, the number of chromosomes that living organisms have varies widely, from 2 in the ant to 6 in the mosquito or the nematode worm, 308 in the black mulberry. And the complexity of an organism doesn't appear to affect the number of chromosomes the organism has. The radiolaria, a simple protozoan, has about 1,600, while humans, which are considered more complex, have only 46. If we were to organize living things based on evolutionary thinking, simple to complex, we'd have an organization like the one on this chart on the screen. If evolution were true, when looking at genetic similarities in chromosomal counts, one might expect that the simplest organism would have the least amount of chromosomes and the most complex organism would have the most, and there'd be a progression. But that's not the case, not even close. The right side of the chart gives the actual progression of chromosomal counts from smallest to largest in order. According to chromosomal count, man is more similar to the bat than to the dog. The truth is, genetic similarities or dissimilarities can be very misleading and simply don't prove what the evolutionists would have you to believe. They do not prove relation or common ancestry. Consider this. A strict comparison of chromosome numbers would indicate that humans are more closely related to the Chinese muntjac, a small deer found in Taiwan's mountainous regions, than to a chimp, because the muntjac has 46 chromosomes, just like man. And a chimp would be most closely related to the tobacco plant, which has 48 chromosomes like the chimp. Clearly, genetic similarities or dissimilarities in no way prove a common ancestry. Now, that said, certain genetic similarities should be completely expected given similar body structures, physiologies, biochemistries, intended diets, given that certain living organisms were designed for life in similar environments, similar habitats, and ultimately given the same designer. Humans and chimps are both mammals and have similar types of internal organs. We both eat fruits and vegetables, which means our mouths and digestive systems will have some similar characteristics. We both have eyes, ears, noses, mouths, fingers. We get sensory information from these body structures. So there's no doubt that there will be many similarities between human and chimp DNA. But you can't jump from A to Z and draw unwarranted conclusions about the evidence, claiming that we evolved from an ape. Similarities exist and should be expected if we share a common designer. And once again, that perspective is in complete harmony with the creation model. But if a person contends that genetic similarities prove we evolved from a common ancestor, problems and inconsistencies abound, as we've seen. The evolutionary model is not in harmony with the evidence. It's not the reasonable scientific choice. It's a biased choice, a choice which typically starts with a baseless assumption, a rejection of all non-natural possibilities for the origin of the universe, holding to that assumption without evidence, rather than allowing the scientific evidence to lead us to the truth, whatever it might be and whether or not we can stomach it. What about horse evolution? Hasn't that been documented in the fossil record? It's definitely been taught as such in biology textbooks for decades. Supposedly, the modern horse, known as Equus, has been documented as evolving from the small fox-like creature known as Hyracotherium, or the Eohippus. One popular biology textbook used in Texas high schools in the 90s said, "The first horse was actually quite small, about the size of a small dog." This illustration shows the first horse as well as several of the intermediate ancestors of today's horse. The 2006 edition didn't rectify the problem. On page 439, the authors used the standard classic pictures of horse evolution to illustrate the nature of evolution by gradualism. John Rennie, writing in the prominent science magazine Scientific American in 2002, in an article titled 15 Answers to Creationist Nonsense, he said, "Actually, paleontologists know of many detailed examples of fossils intermediate in form between various taxonomic groups. A sequence of fossils spans the evolution of modern horses from the tiny Eohippus." So evolutionists tout horse evolution charts as decisive evidence of evolution. The problem is that evolutionists themselves, the ones in the know, long ago abandoned horse evolution as an example of transitional forms. They're realizing that the evidence for a gradual evolutionary progression isn't even available. And so they've decided they really need another theory. They're now moving towards the belief that evolution is less of this straightforward progression and more like maybe a bush with many varying branches. But that hardly fixes the problem with the theory. Actually, it makes it worse since there's even more transitional fossils that need to be found to link species with their common ancestors. David Raup of the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago, he admitted 30 years ago, well, we're now about 120 years after Darwin, and the knowledge of the fossil record has been greatly expanded. Ironically, we have even fewer examples of evolutionary transition than we had in Darwin's time. By this I mean that some of the classic cases of Darwinian change in the fossil record, such as the evolution of the horse in North America, have had to be discarded or modified as a result of more detailed information. What appeared to be a nice, simple progression when relatively few data were available now appears to be much more complex and much less gradualistic. In other words, there's no evidence of transitional creatures linking various kinds in the fossil record. The evidence is needed for evolutionary theory to be possible, but it's simply not there. The famous paleontologist of Harvard, George Gaylord Simpson, way back in 1953, he summed the truth up when he said, "The uniform, continuous transformation of Hyracotherium into Equus, so dear to the hearts of generations of textbook writers, never happened in nature." So some evolutionists proceed to counter with whale evolution. Yeah, well, whale evolution is still well documented, though, so horse evolution is irrelevant anyway. One Science Daily article titled, "Whales Descended from Tiny Deer-like Creature." It said, "Whale evolution is one of the best documented examples of mammal evolution." According to evolutionists, whale evolution is well-documented proof of Darwinian evolution. Supposedly in this well-documented story, whales evolved from mammals that lived on land and that supposedly gradually moved into the water in search of food, fish, and other water prey. In a 2007 edition of Nature magazine, J.G.M. Thewison, who's an evolutionary anatomist and professor at Northeast Ohio Medical University, he claimed to have found the oldest and closest relative of the whale. Now here's the problem. For many years, the hippopotamus was considered to be the closest whale relative. Now remember, the evolution of whales is supposedly one of the most well-documented proofs of evolution. Clearly that means nothing. If the evolution of whales is one of the best documented proofs of evolution, then all of their proofs should be called into question by the scientific community. Because Thewison claims that the evolutionary community needs to totally revamp its entire theory about whale evolution. Supposedly Indohyus, a small, stocky artiodactyl roughly the size of a raccoon, should now be considered the closest relative of the whale, a creature that looks like the African mouse deer. Now, if whale evolution has been so well documented, as evolutionists claim, how can such a major switch be made, seemingly at the drop of a hat, as though it's no big deal? Changing from the hippo as the closest ancestor to a small, stocky artiodactyl roughly the size of the raccoon, they surely can't be as confident about their theories as they led on if such a change can be considered legitimate. Now again, in this supposedly well-documented evolutionary story, whales evolved from land-living mammals that gradually moved into water in search of fish and water-dwelling prey. But now, according to Thewison, it seems that the mammals that gradually moved into the water in search of prey were not carnivores at all. He says, quote, "Clearly this is not the case. Indohyus is a plant eater and already is aquatic. Apparently the dietary shift to hunting animals, as modern whales do, came later than the habitat shift to the water." So with the discovery of one deer-like fossil, the whole alleged evolution of whales is swept aside. Whales didn't evolve from land-dwelling ancestors in search of food. Their ancestors were supposedly already in the water and were herbivores, not carnivores. Not the hippo, a raccoon-sized mouse deer-looking creature. That's some pretty big changes. It seems abundantly clear that the evolutionist case is not as well documented as they pretend. Now consider this. What do you suppose links the Indohyus to the whale? What was so significant about this find that made Thewison want to change the evolutionary lineage of the whale? According to scientists, although Indohyus, as it is known, looks nothing like the whales of today, it shares certain anatomical features. It looks like a mouse deer. It's nothing like a whale. Couldn't it just as easily be said that anything is related to the whale? Doesn't the whale share anatomical features with other creatures too? What makes the Indohyus special? Exactly. Thewison actually admits that these anatomical features are in fact shared with other creatures. He says, all of these characters are found in some mammals unrelated to cetaceans or whales. So what's so special about the Indohyus? The distinguishing feature of the Indohyus appears to be its teeth, which are suggested to be similar to the whale's teeth. The entire evolutionary shift is based on similar teeth. Seriously? How much stock can be put in the similarities between the teeth of a confessed herbivore, Indohyus, and the teeth of whales, which are carnivores, considering herbivores and carnivores have significantly different diets and behaviors? Not much can be gathered from those similarities at all, but what we can gather from this research is that the evolutionary timeline of whales is in no way well documented. It seems to me that evolutionists are frantic and rash in their clamor for finding evolutionary evidence. What about vestigial organs? If evolution were true, and human beings are the current dominating species in a long line of evolutionary changes, starting with an ape-like ancestor, not only would we expect the fossil record to reflect that, but we would expect at least two other things as well. First, there should be human beings alive today in such transitional stages. In other words, we should be able to examine the human population today and find human beings in the process of evolving into better, supposedly more fit creatures, in the process of growing wings or a fifth chamber in our heart or something. In fact, that was the main premise of the old comic book series X-Men. But we see no evidence of that happening. We don't see humans transitioning into growing wings, being able to walk through walls, or gaining super healing immune systems. In fact, as the Earth continues to deteriorate, in keeping with the second law of thermodynamics, we see the opposite occurring. More and more has to be done just to keep us alive as long due to the spreading of disease. More and more genetic conditions, syndromes, and harmful diseases seem to be developing. Second, if evolution were true, we should find vestiges in our bodies, leftovers from our evolutionary ancestors, organs that our ancestors had and used, but which we no longer need, but still have left over in our bodies and genetic code. Evolutionists have historically admitted that such vestiges should be present, and they call such organs vestigial organs, vestiges of our evolutionary ancestry. In 1895, German anatomist Robert Wiedersheim claimed to have identified 86 human vestigial organs. Evolutionists, of course, were elated and promoted the idea that vestigial organs prove evolutionary theory. But one by one, the alleged vestigial organs have been marked off the list. Let's look at 6 often used examples very quickly. The appendix, a very small pouch that hangs off of the end of the large intestine. For several years, scientists didn't know what its use was, so evolutionists consider it to be a vestigial organ. One widely used textbook used in biology classes in its 2006 edition said, in humans, the appendix is an example of a vestigial organ because it carries out no function in digestion. As usual, the textbook writers either failed to get the memo or they ignored it, because now scientists know that the appendix is an important element of the immune system, especially in children. Lymphoid tissue can be found within the appendix, which produces white blood cells that fight disease and infection, especially when we're young. The appendix is relatively larger in children than it is in adults. Also, recent research indicates that the appendix is involved in replenishing good, beneficial bacteria after certain illnesses have eliminated bacteria from the intestines, bacteria which help to keep bad bacteria in check. The appendix is simply not a vestigial organ. The tonsils, once again, were once thought by scientists to be vestigial, pointless, useless vestige of our past evolutionary progression. Scientists now know that tonsils help in fighting off germs. The coccyx, evolutionists believe it's an undeveloped tail and use it as proof that humans evolved from a monkey-like creature since they believed it served no other purpose. However, we now know that the coccyx is actually an important organ in human anatomy. It's the point of attachment for several pelvic muscles that help us to stand up. It also serves as a shock absorber when we sit down. Without it, we wouldn't be able to sit very well or comfortably. Evolutionary scientists also once thought hair was a vestigial organ, a remnant from our ape-like ancestors. We, of course, know today that Hair has many crucial functions in our human anatomy. It protects skin from, for instance, skin cancer, especially on our heads. It serves to help us stay warm and protect the skin from germs. It also serves as a warning system, an alarm system, a tripwire that warns us if something potentially dangerous is crawling on us. Hair is far from being a vestigial organ. The wisdom teeth have long been considered vestigial organs, the idea being that our supposed ape-like ancestors had bigger jaws. So according to evolutionists, extra teeth were needed at that time, but now we supposedly don't need them, and yet there's not enough space in the jaw for them anymore. So they tend to become impacted. They ram into each other teeth. Well, there's several problems with this idea, but I'll mention just one. Scientists have discovered that the dental crowding that causes the impaction of the wisdom teeth is significantly affected by a society's diet. Lombardi, writing in the American Journal of Orthopedics, said, "Dental crowding is endemic among technologically advanced populations and uncommon in primitive groups. In modern man, there is little attrition of the teeth because of a soft, processed diet. This can result in dental crowding and impaction of the third molars." So Western diets cause dental crowding and the impaction of the third molars, or the wisdom teeth, not evolution from some ape-like ancestor. Wisdom teeth are not vestigial organs. What about junk DNA? This alleged evidence is taking center stage in many circles today. Jerry Coyne is an evolutionary geneticist of the University of Chicago. He explained it this way: when a trait is no longer used or becomes reduced, the genes that make it don't instantly disappear from the genome. Evolution stops their action by inactivating them, not snipping them out of the DNA. From this, we can make a prediction. We expect to find in the genomes of many species silenced or dead genes, genes that once were useful but are no longer intact or expressed. In other words, there should be vestigial genes. He and many others believe that that is exactly what we see in the human genome, vestigial genes, or as others call them, pseudogenes, junk DNA, DNA that perhaps our evolutionary ancestors used and needed, but that we no longer need. But as with vestigial organs, as scientists further examine the human genome, they discover that evolutionists once again have been too rash in claiming that they found evidence for evolution. And sadly, as the evidence pours in proving that they were wrong, it's too late to undo the damage done by their false claims. Jonathan Wells is a molecular and cell biologist of the Center for Science and Culture at the Discovery Institute in Seattle. In his book, The Myth of Junk DNA, he cites several prominent evolutionists who used the junk DNA argument. He says, "The arguments by Dawkins, Miller, Shermer, Collins, Kitcher, Coyne, and Aviz rest on the premise that most non-protein coding DNA is junk, without any significant biological function, yet a virtual flood of recent evidence shows that they are mistaken. Much of the DNA they claim to be junk actually performs important functions in living cells. The following chapters cite hundreds of scientific articles that testify to those functions, and those articles are only a small sample of a large and growing body of literature on the subject." The evidence against the junk DNA argument is growing by leaps and bounds. As was the case with vestigial organs, the more we actually learn about the genome, the more we discover the fact that the universe has been intricately designed with specific purposes in mind. In truth, there are no vestiges from evolution because, as we've already been seeing in this seminar, evolution is not only not in harmony with the evidence, it actually contradicts it. The alleged evidence that is said to be conclusively proving of Darwinian evolution is shown to be non-existent the more scientists learn about the universe. In fact, even if there was such a thing as an organ within the human body that appears to no longer be necessary for humans to have today, it still wouldn't prove evolution. From the creationist perspective, it may indicate something about the nature of the earth in the distant past, as God originally created it in the pre-flood era. In other words, if there were such things as useless organs in humans, it wouldn't be because we evolved from some non-human creature that once needed them. It could be because humans once needed such organs in a radically different pre-flood world that we no longer need as much. But ultimately, after scientific knowledge has increased over time, and evolutionists have discovered time and time again that each one of the organs on Wiedersheim's list serves a significant purpose in helping human beings, Many evolutionists are correctly losing faith in the vestigial organ argument. Today, many evolutionists have all but abandoned the idea, and thankfully so, because a strong argument could be made that evolution is a hindrance to scientific progress because of its reliance upon alleged vestigial organs. When Wiedersheim produced his list of vestigial organs, consider the effect that it would have caused in the scientific community. The effect would have been to halt the scientific investigation and study of those organs, or at least to significantly decrease the amount of research being conducted in those areas, since according to evolution, we don't need those organs anymore. How many people have been affected by evolutionists' promotion of the vestigial organ argument because of this? Vestigial organs are a myth. We know that there's an important function for these organs, even if we're not knowledgeable enough yet to figure out the extent of those functions. But once again, textbooks still promote the false idea of vestigial organs. Young people are being duped into believing evolutionary theory by the droves because of such alleged evidence. But don't miss the major implication of this brief look at vestigial organs. If evolution were true, there should be vestigial organs, and yet they're not there. It's as if the human body came into existence exactly as it is today, exactly as it was intended to be, with only minor changes over time. Oh wait, that's what the creation model claims. In the end, the vestigial organ argument has done nothing but provide more evidence that the creation model is the logical explanation for the origin of the universe. We were designed. In our next session, we'll continue to examine the alleged evidences for evolution to see if they do in fact substantiate naturalism.
This has been a presentation of Apologetics Press, an organization dedicated to the defense of New Testament Christianity. Visit us on the web at apologeticspress.org or call 800-234-8558.